Hi, everyone. This is Curtis. This episode of Good Faith features a very timely conversation with my friend Tim Alberta, who has had unparalleled journalistic access to the Trump campaign. Among other topics that we discussed, we talked about how we should be praying for Trump's appointments to senior leadership positions in his administration. Now, we recorded the episode on Tuesday, November 12th, when he and I still retained some modicum of hope for acceptable appointments. In the subsequent days after the recording, Trump announced a series of appointments that, that should be profoundly disturbing to any American, regardless of how you voted. This most recent news that came after our recording only adds extra weight to Tim's advice for how Christians should be praying for the new Trump administration, including now especially praying for a just and sane confirmation process. I hope this episode helps you not just make sense of the world, but also make needed prayers for the world. Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel. And it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And many in the world right now are wondering what to expect from Trump 2.0. Some with great anticipation, some with great anxiety. I've been transparent that I'm in the latter category. But whatever your political convictions, making sense of the world right now includes anticipating what the next Trump administration may be like. And this is why I was so glad when my guest for this episode agreed to come on the Good Faith, my friend Tim Alberta, staff writer for The Atlantic, one of the most astute political reporters around now. And Tim, thank you so much for coming back on the Good Faith Podcast.
Curtis, it is my pleasure. It's good to see you as always, my friend. And listen, I'm just glad that we get to have Thanksgiving. I was fully anticipating a knockdown, drag out legal fight that was going to prevent any of us from even having a holiday. So, you know, my only prayer really leading into last week was let it be clean and quick and decisive one way or another so that we can move on with our lives. And happily, that prayer was answered.
Yeah, well, that's good. Your prayers are powerful. You know, speaking of prayers, we were last together speaking at Wheaton a few months ago, but I was thinking about you and praying as I was praying on election night, Tim, you particular. And that's because I was watching the New York Times probability meter that night. And as somebody who was very much worried about a Trump victory, I was getting more and more depressed as that meter went further and further towards 100%. And at one point it hit 90%. I think it was around 9 p.m. Pacific time. It crossed over 90%. And I was going to just completely, give up and say, forget it. But then I remembered, wait a minute. I remember there was another time when a win probability meter was at 90% and things turned out in my way. And I'm going to share that now at risk of re-traumatizing you, Tim. And it was, of course, I was thinking about last year's NFC championship game between my 49ers and Tim's Detroit Lions. And Tim and I had made a friendly bet with the stakes of buying each other drinks if your team lost. And so the first half, the Lions were just killing the 49ers. They're up 24-7. And I think I remember somewhere midway in the third quarter, the win probability meter by ESPN was at 91.5% in favor of the Lions. So that's when I texted Tim. So Tim, water qualifies as drinks, right? Thinking I'm going to have to buy him drinks. And I really meant it as a joke, but maybe there was some devious part of me thinking maybe this could work as a reverse jinx. And by golly, it did work because the 49ers overcame a 91% win-loss probability rate. So it worked then. I didn't even try it in this case because, look, Brock Purdy wasn't coming out of the locker room to save Kamala Harris. So, Tim, I'm sorry to bring up that story again, but I was thinking about you.
Curtis, the fact that we remained friends after that game was miraculous enough. But for you now to have revisited it on several occasions, not just in this recording, but on several occasions, you're making me. I've really got to wonder. Life is too short to have some of your worst moments as a sports fan replayed again and again and again for you. And here I am basking in an 8-1 start, the best start for the Lions since the 1950s, since the Eisenhower administration, and moving towards a number 1 seed, and just feeling really good about this football season until the ghost of seasons past has to return to haunt me. So, had I known that this would have been one of your lead-ins to our conversation, I think I may have declined this invitation, Curtis.
I'm bringing it up, Tim, to illustrate that great divisions can still be overcome in friendship and even that one. But you're right.
Oh,
that was
we'll go
cruel.
with that. Yes, we'll
that was that will be my last time I bring it up. I think. But it's true. Your Lions are looking amazing. And I'll be quite honest with you. If the 49ers can't make it, I'm all in. I'm rooting for the Lions. Okay, we're not here to talk about football. Tim, you graciously did come, and thank you. And I forgive me for once again twisting the knife just another inch deeper. So, Tim, I'm curious, what was your reaction? How did you go through election night?
Curtis, it was a bit of a conflict, I think, just, wearing my journalist analyst hat here. I had felt really for most of the year as though Trump would win. And, going back to sort of late springtime through midsummer, I was writing about and speaking publicly about my belief that Trump was probably going to win big and that we were heading in that direction. And I think that, Harris replacing Biden atop the Democratic ticket gave everyone a bit of a chance to pause and maybe recalibrate expectations. And even then, though, I still believed and said as much publicly that I just viewed Trump as a favorite, if for no other reason than the fact that when you're in this kind of hyper-polarized trench warfare political environment where both parties are essentially starting with 47% of the vote, and then you're really just competing over the remaining 5-6% of undecided voters, persuadables, and many of those aren't even truly persuadable. Some of those folks will vote third party. Some of them will leave the top of the ticket blank. I mean, a lot of the analytics we were looking at, a lot of the modeling that was done by both parties was suggesting that really you were competing over about 200,000 voters, give or take, across these 6 or 7 battleground states, right? And so that's obviously a very small universe of voters. And I think given those realities, Curtis, my bet was always going to be on the candidate who just had better fundamentals. And what I mean by that is, Kamala Harris was inheriting some significant vulnerabilities, significant weaknesses from Joe Biden, namely inflation and overwhelmingly negative perceptions of the economy from voters across the political spectrum, and the issue of immigration, where not only were voters continually registering that as among their chief concerns and their chief criticisms of Biden and of the Democratic Party, but she was the sort of de facto border czar, whatever you want to argue about the title. That was part of her portfolio, and Republicans saw an opportunity, I think, early on to really bludgeon her over the border. And I think there's some evidence that they were even more successful attacking her over the border than they had been attacking Biden. And so, because of those fundamentals, I always viewed Trump as the favorite. And so I wasn't terribly surprised. I guess to the degree, Curtis, maybe that I was surprised on election night was just seeing the way in which voters were punishing the Democratic Party more than rewarding the Republican Party. I think if you look at the exit polling, if you study some of the VoteCast surveying and look at the analysis piece of this, it's pretty apparent that a lot of voters don't like Donald Trump, don't necessarily trust Donald Trump or the Republican Party, but boy, are they really fed up with the Democratic Party and feel that there's a real disconnect there. And you see that specifically. We can get more into this, obviously, in the weeds, but I would just say, you really see this among working class men in particular, and it doesn't matter their race, it doesn't matter their religious affiliation. A lot of these old qualifiers around, identity in our politics have kind of fallen by the wayside, and it's really this question along kind of economic and cultural lines. If you are a working class man in this country, you really don't feel like the Democratic Party is your home anymore. And obviously that represents kind of a generational sea change for where these two parties have been and now where they are today.
Well, Tim, I think it's such a helpful picture in making sense of what has happened, but I almost don't want to waste my Tim Alberta time on just really great analysis of what has happened, because you actually, I think, are very well positioned to have insights on what will happen. And I take this because of the general premise that one of the great questions that I said I opened with was that what's good the next administration going to be like? What is the future Trump 2.0 going to be like? And I take it as something of a political axiom that one great evidence base for what an administration will be like in the future is to look at what its campaign was like as it won the election. And you were embedded in the Trump campaign in a very deep way. You produced this just really amazing piece in The Atlantic called Inside the Ruthless, Restless Final Days of Trump's Campaign. I encourage everybody to read it. We'll put it in the show notes. Precisely, even though the campaign is over, I think it gives us some clues about what the Trump administration can be like. So, Tim, let's first start with that premise. Is that an accurate premise that something about the way the campaign was run and who was running the campaign will tell us something about what the administration will be like? How accurate is that as a predictive lens?
Yeah, look, I do think it's accurate. Start at the top, right? The person who was in charge of the Trump campaign, the top official, was a woman named Susie Wiles, veteran Republican operative, very well respected. And she really did an outstanding job just at the nuts and bolts of running Trump's campaign in 2024. This was far and away the most professional, the most sophisticated, the most disciplined campaign of any of Trump's three runs at the White House. And Susie deserves a lot of the credit for that. There were some other people involved. Her partner in running things was a guy named Chris LaCivita, who I think also deserves a lot of credit. But Susie has already been named as Trump's chief of staff heading into the White House. And that makes history. She will be the first woman chief of staff. And I think there's a reason that you see everyone from the kind of MAGA hangers-on in Trump's orbit all the way to people like Jeb Bush praising Susie Wiles and congratulating her publicly on that appointment, because she is someone who really does have the respect and the admiration of a lot of folks in the Republican political class. She's smart, she's serious, she's good at what she does, right? And part of being good at what she does in this context is, as I've written about throughout the past year when writing these sort of dispatches from inside of Trump world, is that Susie is uniquely good at kind of talking Trump out of bad ideas and kind of pressing him a little bit. And she knows when to pull back. I've detailed some cases where she couldn't talk him out of certain bad ideas, like letting Laura Loomer onto the campaign plane, for instance. Like that was and that wound up being a huge mistake on the campaign side. But I think what you'll see in the White House is someone at the center of gravity here in Susie Wiles, the chief of staff, who will attempt to play traffic cop and make sure that, only the people who really need to get in to see Trump are able to see Trump, while at the same time kind of acknowledging Curtis, as Susie has acknowledged to me on the record, that listen, this guy, he's got a phone and he likes to talk on it. And if if the phone rings and it's Mike Lindell, then he might pick it up and talk to Mike Lindell. Like, and there's not a whole lot she can do about it, right? But she will be in the West Wing playing some traffic cop. She will also, I think, be serving as an intermediary between some of Trump's key allies on Capitol Hill, elsewhere in the administration, and try to create a more efficient, streamlined flow of information and kind of and regiment the decision-making process in some ways that frankly never happened during Trump's first term in office. Now, what I'm painting here is the sort of the rosy scenario, the best case scenario if you're Susie, that she will be able to step in and with the help of some other senior officials who are loyal to her and who got the program during this campaign run in 2024, they will come in and be effective in trying to administer the administration. There's, of course, a worst case scenario, which is that Susie gets rolled early on, the same way that Reince Priebus got rolled, the same way that, for all intents and purposes, John Kelly, Mick Mulvaney, others got rolled. And again, I don't think Susie, to be clear, is under any sort of illusion about who Donald Trump is. She knows the people who have come and gone. She has surely taken a look at the graveyard of former senior aides and officials who wound up on Trump's bad side and kind of got exiled from his inner circle. But, there's a sense in which I think some people who have been around Trump over the past year will say, look, if anybody can get him to behave, if anybody can get him to sort of check some of his own worst impulses and act a little bit more responsibly and dial things back even just 10% towards being a little bit calmer and saner, then it's Susie Wiles, right? We will see. I think so much of what we saw during the first 4 years of Trump's presidency, starting in January of 2017, was that he had surrounded himself in that administration with a lot of people, Curtis, who either didn't particularly like him or often didn't agree with him on just policy matters, and then certainly found themselves at times sort of disgusted by, offended by, alienated by some of his rhetoric, his behavior. And so that caused tension, it caused infighting, it led to a lot of leaking and gossip and palace intrigue and a lot of drama surrounding that West Wing. And of course, Trump is the driver of that drama, to be clear. He is the one who sort of creates the chaos, and it ripples outward from him. And we've seen that in his campaigns. We obviously saw it in his presidency. I do wonder if this time around, Trump, having learned some of those lessons and having talked both privately and publicly about how he was kind of snookered in a way that, talked into bringing some of these people into the fold, only to later find out that they weren't really loyal to him. If he course corrects and fills out his administration with a lot of yes men and yes women and people who are less given to trying to kind of get their own way and are more inclined just to sort of fall in line and do what he wants, then it actually could make for a much smoother and less chaotic White House, and potentially also produce a lot more on the results side, legislatively and through executive action. So I think that's what a lot of us are waiting to see, particularly in these first couple of months of the administration. They've got the House, they've got the Senate. They're almost surely going to have the House by a very small majority, but these first couple of months, I think, will tell us a lot about, are they better organized? Are they rowing in the same direction? Has Trump successfully installed people who will do his bidding, or is it going to devolve back into another family feud the way that much of his first administration was?
Tim, as you described that, I'm struck by I'm torn inside, thinking I don't know what I'm rooting for. I don't know what I'm hoping for. Like, am I hoping for that there are going to be adults in the room? Because I think a lot of folks are still clinging on to some shred of hope. But maybe he'll surround himself with the kinds of folks who are responsible, who aren't going to give in to his worst impulses, and going to be, like I said, the adults in the room. But as you've mentioned, that's going to produce sort of chaos of its own kind. And well, what if he gets a yes men? Well, that sounds like that could be a worse situation for if you care about kind of our country, and that it goes into some vision that can actually encompass the interests of all Americans, not just a very narrow slice of his base. Like, what should we be rooting for, especially as Christians, Tim, in terms of the people that he's going to be surrounding himself with?
Yeah, I would emphasize the as Christians part of it, Curtis. Not as Republicans, not as Democrats, or people concerned about winning back some seats in 2026, or winning the presidency in 2028. Whatever those longer term political implications aside, I think Christians should be, I think, hoping for and praying for, above all else, wise counsel surrounding the president. This is someone who is famously quite impulsive, and who is also famously, I think, receptive to a wide range of ideas, perhaps a wider range of ideas than people would otherwise know. This is not someone who, aside from a couple of notable issues, this is not someone with really a well-formed ideological worldview. And so he likes to hear dissent. He likes to have some disagreement and some debate. And because of that, I think that anyone hoping for the good of the country, the good of their neighbor, for the flourishing of civil society, that they should hope that the voices that find their way into the president's ear most prominently are voices that reflect a commitment to that sort of human flourishing and the good of all, in ways that could produce outcomes that are pleasantly surprising. Not pleasantly surprising to the left or to the right or any of that, just pleasantly surprising to people who have justifiable concerns about the man himself, and about his character, and about his judgment, and about his moral compass, as it were. And so, I would just stress, Curtis, that for whatever the faults of Mike Pence, and I've written about them more than most, and the former vice president and I have had some colorful back and forth over the years. But I've written this, and I would stand by it now, that I always viewed Mike Pence as a good and decent man. I believe that he made some compromises politically and otherwise that were really disappointing. And friends of his, people who've known him for a long time, felt the same way. But ultimately, Pence was a voice for calm, and a voice for decency in the room with Trump at some pivotal moments, none more pivotal, of course, than in the aftermath of the 2020 election. And ultimately on January 6th, when Pence refused to do what Trump was pressuring him to do, which was to unilaterally kind of push aside the Constitution and help to keep Trump installed as president despite losing a free and fair election. We know that there were some other voices in the White House counsel's office, on Capitol Hill. We know that there were some adults in the room, some people who were angels on the shoulder, right, trying to convince Donald Trump to do the right thing. We just, I think, have to hope as Christians that there will be some more of those angels this time around, and that they will not be shouted down by the devils on the other shoulder.
And do you think that's actually likely? Because you would think somebody of Trump's psychology would view those folks, Pence as the paramount example, as people who betrayed him. And so he's not going to make that same mistake again. He's going to screen for just yes men or women Do you see that happening in these initial appointments? I mean, is Susan Wiles, Stephen Miller, these are some of the appointments that have come down. How do you read those tea leaves to say, okay, there's still room possibly for those better angels to be on his shoulder?
You know, it's probably too early to draw any sweeping conclusion, Curtis. I would say that Susie Wiles is a rational political actor and someone who, when I've talked with her, spent time with her, I've always walked away feeling as though this was a sober minded individual who loves the country and wants the best for her kids and grandkids, and is not someone who is out to you know douse the country in kerosene and then play with matches.
Mm.
And then on the other side of the ledger, you look at Stephen Miller being installed as a, whatever the official title, sort of deputy chief of staff or policy or whatever. I mean, this will be someone who's one of the 3 or 4 most important voices in the administration. And, yes, that is concerning because of his history, because of his rhetoric, because of his beliefs. I mean, this is someone who I think when you look back to that Madison Square Garden rally, for all of the wailing and gnashing of teeth about this vulgar comedian and his jokes, I think maybe the more enduring concern was Stephen Miller. And I was there in the arena, right center, watching as he delivered this speech saying that America is for Americans and Americans only. And Stephen Miller is a student of history. He knows the origins of that commentary. He understands the historical parallels going back to 1940s Germany. This is not accidental. And so Stephen Miller, I think, is going to play an outsized role each and every day, sort of pushing Trump to be more belligerent, to be more nativist, to be more hateful, frankly, in certain respects. But then I think on the other side, you will have some people like a Susie Wiles. And I would even also point to, the State Department, this appointment of Marco Rubio, reported appointment. I don't think Trump has confirmed it as of yet, unless I missed his statement saying so. But if in fact Marco Rubio is appointed to be Secretary of State, that would signal, I think, to a lot of people that Trump is interested in surrounding himself with some more of those maybe traditionally conservative voices. And so, as opposed to someone maybe like a Rick Grinnell, who also was going to be under consideration for Secretary of State, who's a little bit more MAGA fringy. So it's very early, and I think we've got a long way to go until we can really get a sense of, the personnel is policy. So who are the personnel, and then what will the policy be? In a few months, we'll have a pretty good window into that. But as of now, I think the prayerful approach is the only one.
Yeah. Oh, this is so helpful, Tim, to give us some substance and specific guidance to know how to pray for this new administration. And it sounds like his choices about who to surround himself with are really, really critical. And that was what really struck me about your reporting. Was how important not only the people are, but the dynamics between those people in terms of shaping what comes out of a campaign or administration. I mean, we are, have a naive view of that an administration or any organization is like this rational being that emanates simply from the directives from the head, or if not from the exact head, then it's from the subheads underneath. And one of the things that really struck me when I read your article on the Trump campaign was, wow, it's not that, certainly, because there's so many other voices, but it's actually the interaction of these voices that sometimes actually produces the results. Like you talked about the Madison Square Garden thing, and it's like, wow, that originated from an inner sort of rivalry and a fight to just who would get closer into Trump. And it was a maneuver that actually produced that result, in-group maneuver, if you will. So can you say a little bit more as you project that dynamic out in administration? What are the kind of dynamics, not just the people, but the actual relational dynamics that are going to actually dictate what this administration does?
So a couple of things, Curtis. The first thing you have to understand about Trump, and anyone who has read some of the volumes on this man, whether they've come from journalists, friends, family members, they all reach a similar point of consensus around this idea that Trump really likes conflict. He's someone who, not necessarily confrontation, right? Because in fact, a lot of people who've spent time around Trump will tell you that he's not really big on, like face to face, dialing up the volume and really going at it with someone, confrontation, but he likes conflict and he likes competition, especially among his lieutenants. And he sort of encourages it. It almost reminds you of this scene in Batman, one of the Batman movies, where Joker like breaks the pool cue in half and tosses one piece of it in to the group of guys and says basically winner take all, right? Whoever is the last man standing will come work for me. There's a bit of that with Trump. Actually, there's more than a bit of it. There's a lot of it with Trump. That is sort of famously or infamously a big part of his managerial style. And so whenever you pause to look under the hood at Trump world, whether it's his previous campaigns, whether it's his presidency, whether it's this campaign, or whether it's his coming second presidency, when you see the chaos, when you see the infighting, when you see the leaking and the backbiting and the betrayal, understand that this is not a deviation from the norm. This is the norm. It's very much by design, because the people who are underneath Trump, they feel like this is what he wants. They feel like they have a green light to take their shot. And so it was remarkable and very unsettling to a lot of people around Trump who had watched Susie Wiles and Chris LaCivita build this very successful campaign in 2024, that suddenly in the late summer, like August, suddenly Corey Lewandowski, the once exiled former campaign manager from 2016, who brings with him loads of personal baggage and scandal, suddenly he parachutes back into the Trump campaign with authorization from the candidate himself, going around telling people, hey, I'm running the show now. I'm going to be doing an audit of the campaign. All decisions are going to go through me. Department heads are going to report to me. You need to tell me what's going on. I'm going to be the one making the decisions. And Chris and Susie are looking around saying, wait, what? What are you talking? Where did this come from? And you've got a whole staff who are sort of, suddenly looking over their shoulder, uncertain of who they report to and who they should be loyal to. And it's this kind of chaos and confusion that suddenly starts to roil the campaign. And down the home stretch, the campaign is almost falling apart. You've got staffers who are reporting that morale has just plummeted and that nobody really knows what to do. Nobody knows who they're even answering to. A lot of people saying, I'm not sure I can even work in the administration moving forward after this experience. All of that was completely unnecessary. It was disruptive. It was harmful to the campaign in more ways than one. And yet it was not accidental. It wasn't something that just sort of happened by virtue of a weird convergence of fact. It was very much by design. And this is in keeping with everything we know about Trump and his management style. All of that is just a long way of saying, Curtis, that this sort of interrelational aspects of this are important, because in that first Trump White House, he very deliberately set up these competing power centers. So he had Steve Bannon here and Reince Priebus here. He had H.R. McMaster here, and he had Rex Tillerson here, John Kelly here, and Jim Mattis here. Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell on the Hill side pitted against some of the people who, in their own conferences, like Jim Jordan and Mark Meadows, Ted Cruz, Mike Lee, and others, who were constantly undermining them despite their leadership positions on the Hill. So the point here is that this was very much the blueprint in Trump's first term. It was to set up these competing power centers, let these people go at it, and the relationships, to the extent that they ever had existed, were pretty much frayed within like the first few months of the administration. This time around, from everything I've come to understand and from some of the other reporting that's publicly available, there seems to be a concerted effort to push Trump away from that, to try to, yes, there will be some inevitable power struggles. Yes, there will be some inevitable conflict, but to at least try to see about establishing a more coherent power structure among people who are generally like-minded, among people who generally don't loathe one another, and see if that can't produce a smoother, more streamlined process to try to get more results. And we'll see, Curtis. I have, just having covered Trump a long time, having been around these people, I have serious doubts. I have real skepticism as far as whether any Trump political operation can ever be smooth and seamless and drama-free, but that's what they're going for.
I think it's important to point out the different contexts between a campaign and administration. Like in a campaign, let's say you're somebody like me that's actually hoping Trump loses. There's a way in which, to go back to our football world, that you can sort of root for chaos on the other sidelines. Like famously, Bill Belichick in the Super Bowl against the Seahawks saw the chaos on the Seahawks line, and that's why he didn't call a timeout. And that led to that famous play at the goal line where Russell Wilson throws the game-losing interception. So like as somebody in the partisan conflict moment in a campaign, there's a way you're like, man, I hope they're disorganized. I hope they're chaotic. And so that, maybe that'll cause them to lose. But once that side actually wins the White House and is running the government, I think I don't want chaos. I don't want a messy, chaotic, disorganized, administration, even if some of the policies they're pursuing are not ones that I support. I mean, I just think, well, what happens when China, is amassing its fleet to invade Taiwan? I don't want the administration in that moment to be completely disorganized and in chaos. So Tim, and I think especially when I think about this in terms of its global affairs, that it's really important that we are not a chaotic presence in the world, lurching unpredictably in one direction or another. Who would be some more people, Tim, that we should be looking for and hope that they make their way, because they will, even if we don't agree with all of their partisan views, they will bring some level of stability, some level of cohesion, and again, I use that word, adultness, into that room. What are people that might be that are on your screen, since you know the players, that maybe have a shot that we should be like praying for? Gosh, I hope they have God, please somehow bring them into this moment to have some restraining role.
It's a good question, Curtis. It's a bit of a tricky one to answer because, for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think, what we've seen in recent years is that any number of people who have come into Trump's orbit, who we have expected might play a productive role, either haven't. They've been kind of sucked in, and they've been kind of warped and turned into something a little bit different than what they were, and that has been kind of tragic to watch. Or they sort of have stuck to their guns, and they wind up pushed out pretty quickly and tarred and feathered on the way out, and wind up sort of banished from the Republican Party, or from the conservative movement, or from both, in the case of Mike Pence, for example. So I don't want to, you know me well enough to know that I'm not in the business of peddling a lot of false hope. And sometimes that probably, errs too far on the side of gloominess and of cynicism. I just think, your point a minute ago is exactly the right one about looking from the other sideline and looking for chaos. And it's not about Democrats looking from their sideline. It's about China looking from their sideline. Right. It's about Russia looking from their sideline. It's about North Korea and Iran and other state actors who would love nothing more than to see the United States collapse under the weight of its own tribal polarization, right? So, yes, we should hope that our government at the federal level and especially at the executive level can project a competence and a seriousness that sort of deters our adversaries from inciting any sort of mass geopolitical conflict that leads to death and destruction at devastating scales, right? Of course, we should hope for that. And I would say, Curtis, like, since he's already been named, I'm comfortable going back to focus on a guy like Marco Rubio for a minute.
Yeah.
Now, Marco Rubio is someone who I have some real issues with by virtue of how he was not just a Trump critic, but really someone who was pointing to Trumpism as a disease in the Republican Party and talking about the ways in which it was corroding kind of the soul of conservatism and how people on the right were going to have to answer for how they had allowed this to happen. I think Rubio is a pretty discouraging case in some respects of what happens when people on the right look around, they see which way this is headed, they know that they're beaten, and it's kind of a decision between becoming irrelevant or licking your wounds and joining them and becoming a part of this thing that you once despised. And obviously Rubio, like so many others, has chosen that latter path. And yet, despite all of that, Curtis, I've spent time with Rubio over the years, talked with him, studied him pretty closely. And I think that this is someone who has a very traditional, I used that word earlier, but a very traditional and sort of conventionally conservative worldview, and someone who, as Secretary of State, in dealing with those state actors that I mentioned earlier, will, I think, for whatever chaos may be happening in the background behind him at the White House or in Washington, he will project a seriousness and a competence and a sort of, don't test us attitude that will be good and that will be helpful. I mean, he is someone who I think even a lot of Democrats in Washington are relieved that he'll be Trump's guy at the State Department. So, and I would even, like, another person who I might look to, because she's already been named, is Elise Stefanik at the United Nations. Now, Stefanik, even more so than Rubio, is someone who I find to be just really cynical. And I had conversations with Elise Stefanik in the couple of years leading up to Trump's takeover and then sort of during Trump's takeover. And Elise Stefanik was someone who was horrified of Trump and who represented something very different in the Republican Party. She was a John Boehner, Kevin McCarthy protege, a Paul Ryan disciple who wanted something very different for the Republican Party. And to see how she's gone sort of full MAGA is just, among other things, sort of weird. And it's a little bit like disconcerting at a personal level. And I know that friends of hers feel that same way. But she is someone who is very competent and very, I think, very serious. And she'll, at the UN, especially when it comes to anti-Semitism and dealing with a lot of the kind of clownish behavior at the United Nations, like, she will project that same, like, we're the United States, don't get cute with us sort of attitude that you would want, especially if it's coming against the backdrop of the expected chaos in Washington.
I want to read one of the core biblical passages that commands Christians to do this act of praying for your rulers, even rulers you might disagree with. Timothy 2, 1-2 says, I urge then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and all those in authority. And here's the interesting point. What's the reason? What's the direction of this prayer for kings and all those in authority? Paul writes, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. And so there's a directional, it's not just pray to bless in a generic sense. There's actually a direction to the prayers we're supposed to have for kings and all those in authority, all kings and all those in authority, that they may act and rule in a way that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. We've been talking a little bit about that we can pray right now that Trump appoints rulers and authorities under him that can govern and administer in a way that leads towards, both in this country, but especially in this world, peace and quiet, godliness and holiness. Tim, I find that when I'm praying for somebody, that it makes a huge difference if I can humanize them, if I can understand a little bit of who they are as a person versus just as an abstract kind of a concept, if you will. And for me, it's very difficult. I try to, but it's very difficult to pray for Trump because I don't know him, and he's just a conglomeration of, for me in my mind, of vices that I find very troubling. How do you pray for somebody like that? So, Tim, can you help me? Like, what you have spent much more time, you know more Trump as a person. Take that knowledge of Trump as a person and give me some guidance. What should my prayers be like for him as a person, so that all of us may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness?
Wow. Well, Curtis, one of the striking things for people who have never spent time around Trump, don't know him well, but then who sort of come into his orbit and get to know him, is that in private, he is sort of can be sort of a remarkably hospitable, a very warm, really, for a guy who, of course, spent his lifetime and made his fortune in the hospitality business, someone who is very attentive to detail, really wants to make sure that people have what they need, that when they're in his company, whether that's on his airplane, whether that's at his hotel or dining on his patio, whatever, that they're happy, that they're satisfied. And so, that was a pretty consistent thing that you would see in his first campaign. Then when he went into the White House, a lot of people who didn't know him and who came in with some negative perceptions, and frankly, many of whom still left with negative perceptions. One of the things that they liked about him was they felt like he was someone who saw you and who would pay attention to you, even if you were sort of a junior person. Would ask, hey, what's your name? Where are you from? How are you doing? Hey, did you get something to eat? Get this guy something to eat, that sort of thing. Yeah. And this was also, predating his political career. When he was on a construction site somewhere, he was known to like yuck it up with the blue collar hard hat guys and sort of, bring them lunch or whatever it was, right? Like, so this is like a thing that's kind of been known about Trump. I think another thing is, it sounds a little bit trite, I'm sure, because anyone listening might say, well, okay, good, that's a bare minimum, but it's important. I think he is a family guy. He loves his family, he loves his kids, loves his grandkids. He, from all accounts, people who have spent a lot of time with him will say that like the one soft spot you see with him tends to be his grandchildren, and that he is, invested in being their grandfather. And so that's, I think a helpful humanizing point to linger on, especially given the fact that the guy was shot and almost died this summer, right? Like that is, I have often found myself sort of recoiling at the language and the antics used by his sons, by his two adult sons, his two eldest sons, Don Jr. and Eric, which I think at times has been really just reprehensible, frankly. And yet I have to remind myself, to pray for them in the context of, one's father being one of the most hated men on the planet and being in the crosshairs, literally and figuratively at all times, and someone who is obviously going to be under enormous scrutiny, under enormous pressure here for the next 4 years. I think if anyone's father was in that position, you would feel for their children a little bit, right? And you would pray for them to have a peace and a comfort and also a calming influence on their father in that situation. So I guess those are a couple of insights I might offer, just to remind anyone listening that regardless of how you feel about any elected official, that they are at the end of the day a human being like the rest of us, and they wake up in the morning and put their one foot in front of the other and look in the mirror and think about how they're going to get through the day. And so and these are people who are made in the image of God and who are constantly in need of prayer, just the same as you and I are, Curtis.
Yeah, actually, Tim, that's really helpful. I mean, one of the ways I try to pray in reminding somebody is the image of God is to actually try to call to mind ways in which they actually are faithfully imaging some character of God, and pray that God would widen that part of their being, and it would, redeem their worser parts. And so I'm going to actually take your insight about Trump as it having inherently some way in which he likes to welcome people, wants people to feel welcome and home. And I'm going to be praying that widens not just to his tribe and his supporters, but that just begins to widen more to the other Americans that didn't vote for him. And that feels like that's a prayer. That's a prayer that God would want me to pray. And who knows what God can do with that. Tim, I want to actually pivot now to talking about the church. We've talked about the administration and what to expect in the administration. You also wrote what I think is one of the definitive books about what happened to the American evangelical church. I'm talking, of course, of the kingdom and the power and the glory, and what the political hijacking by Trumpism that started and extending before that, what that has done to the church. Connect the dots between the kingdom, the power, and the glory, and this election. Like, what does this election presage for the state of the church, and how might that translate into prayers for the church in this moment?
That's the big question for me, Curtis. Look, I don't think, electorally speaking, that we saw anything surprising on the 5th of November. We saw roughly 80% of white evangelicals vote for Donald Trump, much the same as we did in the previous two elections. And some of the familiar fault lines around certain issues were predictive, as they've been in the past. And I don't know that any of the bold predictions about what might come to pass, as far as significant numbers of evangelicals sitting out the election in protest, or a significant amount of evangelicals bucking against Trump to sort of make a statement about their displeasure with this, unholy alliance of republicanism and Christianity. Like, I don't think any of that really came to pass, at least not at scale. You may have seen sort of small glimpses of it in certain pockets of the country, but I think, generally speaking, it was the status quo. And what that makes me wonder is, does the church here over the next 4 years remain on this same sort of steady trajectory that it's been on, which in my view is not a good trajectory. I don't know that it is a doomsday trajectory. In some cases, you could envision a much darker near-term outlook for the church had Trump lost again, and had there been a sort of groundswell of militant, like, we must
take back the country and resist. The
end really is near now,
right.
and these next 4 years are our last stand. And actually, now it's not just about Trump; it's about, like, our survival. And suddenly the Charlie Kirks and the Eric Metaxases of the world are leading something that is altogether different, and again, I think potentially even darker and sort of more sinister. You could like conceive of that in an alternate universe here. I think in this universe, with Trump winning, are some of these actors on the Christian nationalist right, are they emboldened? Yes. Will they have allies in high places? Yes. Will they leverage those relationships and their power, or at least proximity to power, to actually affect change in a substantive, meaningful way, at least in terms of advancing their agenda, to sort of promote and enforce their more militant version of Christianity in this country. I don't know. I don't know. And part of the reason I don't know, Curtis, is I think I said this at the outset, that Donald Trump is not an ideological man in a lot of ways. He has a few pet issues that he really does, I think, care about personally. But, people asked, for example, over the past 6, 7, 8 months, why is he distancing himself from Roe v. Wade being overturned? Why isn't he embracing the idea of a national abortion ban, or at least leaving himself open to it, rather than at times seeming to go out of his way to kind of antagonize pro-lifers and distance himself from them? I think, one answer to that was, well, it's politically advantageous for him, and they recognize that, the suburban college-educated women are probably the key to this election in a lot of ways. That's true. But I think the other answer to it, the more relevant answer, Curtis, is that Trump doesn't much care about the issue of abortion. It's just not something that he is personally invested in, never has been, probably never will be. And I think when you look at some of the other issues, some of the other culture war issues, Trump very early on was bringing log cabin Republicans into the fold, and talking at the 2016 convention about how the Republican Party would champion gay rights. From everything I understand, Trump, much less so than even the people around him, is really animated by the transgender issue. Like, he'll make an off-the-cuff remark about it or whatever, but it's not something he really focuses on. I think really, Curtis, this issue about church and state and what may come of a coordinated, unprecedented offensive to try and assert Christianity as a more dominant and so almost administratively subversive force in American life. I don't know that Trump has any interest in that. I don't know that he has any time for it. I don't know that he will listen to people trying to convince him that that's a good idea. Remember, this is someone who grew up in Queens, did not go to church, and was surrounded by a lot of Jews and knew quite a few Muslims, and a lot of people who were just altogether secular. So on the one hand, you've got some people who are in Trump's orbit who are absolutely primed to make a push, for example, even on kind of a symbolic front of like a declaration of Christianity as state religion, as America's, state religion. That's, however empty or toothless it may be, that would be historic, and it would be a very, very big deal, right? I'm just not sure that Trump would even have that conversation, much less be talked into it, right? And then there are some other things around the edges. I just don't know that Trump, especially now that he's not running for re-election again. You heard from certain Christian conservative leaders in this election feeling like Trump was kind of spurning them and that he didn't need them anymore. I almost wonder if that's exacerbated, Curtis, and that if in this term, this final term of his, he's already said, this is my last campaign, I'm not running again. It's interesting. I know this is a long answer, but I'll just close on this one last thought, Curtis. I've had more than one person close to Trump in the past 6 months or so, unsolicited, think out loud with me about, the fact that this really is someone who longs for acceptance, longs to be well-liked and popular, and that he will be thinking about his legacy in this second term. And of course, this may sound crazy to some people who say that, no, this guy is the most divisive person ever, and he pits the country against it. Sure, all that is true. But could there be even some slight course correction, some slight remodulating of the Trump political persona in these next 4 years, in ways that are meant to appeal not to like the left, but at least to the center, right?
Yeah.
And if that's the case, if we see any of that, Curtis, I think it becomes very difficult to imagine a world in which Trump is suddenly like locking arms with Eric Metaxas and trying to, demand the Bible be part of core K through 12 curriculum. Like, I just don't know. I don't think that that's likely.
Yeah. Well, that's going to be another insight, Tim, that's going to guide my prayers. I'm going to pray that Trump's thoughts and heart turn something towards his own mortality, and him to ask, what kind of legacy does he want to leave for the future, for future generations, for his grandchildren that he loves. I'm going to pray for that human aspect of himself, that would somehow be a humanizing influence. Tim, I'm going to let you go, but I want to ask you to just put on your pastor's hat, because one of the things as I've gotten to know you is you're a journalist, but you actually have or maybe a preacher's hat. I think is somewhere inside you, inherited from your dad. I think. Sum up what's the message you want to preach to Christians listening to this podcast who are trying to be faithful followers of Jesus? Can you give us what's the closing line to that sermon, Tim?
Well, boy, I'm not a preacher, Curtis, as you know,
no,
and
you
I don't
are.
even I don't even pretend to moonlight as one. But I'll steal something. I'll steal a couple of things actually from real preachers. The first thing is something I've said on your podcast before, which is from my dad. One of his old lines that he used to deploy with some regularity was that as Christians, we are called to be in sales, not in management. And I just think it's a helpful reminder, whether your party's in the White House, whether the other party's in the White House, whether you love the president or hate the president, it doesn't matter. Like, your job is not to try to manage the world around you, right? If you are a Christian, your job is to sell Christ. That's it. And when you do that, and when you do it successfully, good things will happen. Like, guaranteed, good things will happen. The second pastoral advice or insight that I would share is actually from a pastor I don't know, but one of his congregants had pulled me aside in Texas after I was speaking at some event earlier this year and told me this line that their pastor had been saying every Sunday from the pulpit. And I'm forgetting his name, you'll have to forgive me, but it was really, I think, to the point, concise, and so powerful. Said, this pastor kept telling his congregation, you can't evangelize those you demonize. And it doesn't need any further explanation, but it's just something that for us all to keep in mind. It's very easy to demonize people in this era, this political era of ours, but you have no hope of bringing the gospel to people who you demonize. And then the final thing, Curtis, I know that there are some people despairing over the results of this past election. And I understand it. Again, no one, I shouldn't say no one, but very few people have spent more time over the past decade spilling as much ink on Donald Trump and his lies and his character defects as I have. I'm very clear-eyed about who the man is. But I also, I can just be totally honest with you. I did not wake up Wednesday morning of last week filled with any dread or anxiety, because of something actually that my pastor had said the Sunday before Election Day. I shared this on Twitter, and I think some people liked it and benefited from it. But he said, do we believe that the God who spoke the days of the week into existence is bigger than a Tuesday in November? Right? And if we really do, then we should not allow the results of that Tuesday in November to dictate how we treat people, how we view our faith, how we engage with our community, how we participate in the church and in the body of Christ more broadly. We cannot allow the fleeting and ephemeral implications of an election to change our identity in Christ. And so I guess with those three borrowed and attributed bits of wisdom from real preachers, Curtis, I would leave you all with that.
This is why you're a preacher. You know you got to end on 3 points, so that you just successfully
right.
stuck the landing there. Good job, Tim. Hey, thank you, Tim, so much for sharing your insight. And listeners, thank you for joining with us in this moment in time where we are trying to make sense of the world, and we're doing it together with friends who follow Jesus. Join us next week as we once again gather around the campfire. And let's remember that what we do around the campfire, that one of those key activities is prayer, and it's praying for those who are in authority. And I hope this podcast and Tim's insights has helped all of us learn how to pray a little bit more, a little bit better for those who are in authority. And we'll be back next week. Thank you.